Të dashur miq, selam aleikum. Sot është data 23 maj 2020 dhe sot kemi me ne një aktivist nga Skocia. Ai është zoti Mick Napier, nëse ja prononcova si duhet emrin. Zoti Mick është një nga themeluesit e organizatës skoceze për solidaritet me Palestinën. Termi në anglisht i organizatës është Scottish Palestine Solidarity Campaign. Zoti Mick është një aktivist i vjetër për çështjen e Palestinës dhe sot, ashtu sikur edhe dje kur biseduam me përfaqësuesin e rinisë së Fatahut nga Nablusi, zotin Raed Dedi, edhe sot do të flasim me zotin Mick Napier, po ja them sipas prononcimit tonë shqiptar emrin, mbi tragjedin palestineze, mbi përkujtimin e ditës së Nakbas dhe mbi të gjitha, mbi planin ogurzi që pritet të godasi Palestinën në punë pak javësh apo ditësh, i cili sipas qeverisë ekstremiste qifute zioniste të Benjamin Netanyahut, qeveria izraelite planifikon që të aneksojë dhe të shkatrojë në mënyrë totale shtetin e Palestinës. Pa e zgjatur më shumë, po e ftoj zotin Mick në bisedën tonë. Biseda do të bëhet në anglisht dhe për ata që dinë gjuhën angleze, shpresoj që ta pëlqejnë këtë bisedë që do kemi. Hello, Mr. Mick, if I pronounce your name correctly. Thank you very much for coming on my show. Yesterday we had an interview with Mr. Raed Debi. He was a representative of Fatah from Nablus, and with him we spoke about the forthcoming plan of the Israeli regime of Benjamin Netanyahu, which aims to annex West Bank and give an end to the Palestinian state. You are a veteran campaigner on behalf of human rights and Palestinians. You are one of the founding members, if I'm not wrong, of the Scottish Palestine Solidarity Campaign. And we would like to have your views and share them with our viewers here in Balkans about what we as Europeans can do to support the Palestinian case and give an end to the Israeli apartheid regime. Before starting, I would like if you can introduce yourself to us and pronounce your name correctly, because it seems that I made some mistakes when I spelled your name.
Well, thank you, Olsi, for the opportunity to speak to an audience in the Balkans on your programme. I'm very grateful. My name's Mick Napier. I'm speaking to you from Scotland. To speak to a Balkan audience, many of your people have grim memories and experience of efforts to solve political problems by ethnic cleansing, by driving out people who are considered to be undesirable. That's what happened in Palestine in 1948. And there's no doubt about it. It's a historical fact. One eminent Israeli historian, for example, Benny Morris, describes rather well. He's a very accomplished historian. And he describes what happened in 1948, that using murder and rape and terrorism, the majority of the native people of Palestine were driven out from their homes and their homeland. And we can believe Benny Morris because he's no radical, he's no left-winger. He later lamented the fact that the ethnic cleansing had not been completed, and he wished that it had been. So his acknowledgement of what happened in 48 is important, because there are attempts today by Zionist and pro-Israel elements to deny that it took place, to claim somewhat implausibly that Palestinians left of their own volition. But, you know, never in the history of the world have a people left their own lands voluntarily to make way for colonists. And this is simply one of the many ridiculous claims made by the Zionists. It's important to look at what happened 72 years ago, and the commemoration was only a few days ago. And Al-Quds Day, which is connected to that, was only yesterday. It's important to acknowledge and to understand what happened, because this isn't looking at history as something tied up and finished. In Scotland, for example, history is extremely cruel just north of here. And many of the people a few miles north of where I'm speaking were driven out and killed, and their ancestors now live in Australia or New York. But that ethnic cleansing is completed. Sadly, there's nothing we can do about it. But the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians is ongoing. It continues. And since 1948 until today, not a week has gone by without land being taken by fraud or by violence from Palestinians and reserved exclusively for the benefit of Jews, Israeli Jews or Jews coming from abroad. But it may not be used for the benefit of Palestinians, even Palestinian citizens of Israel. And this is an ongoing process. I'm involved in a campaign with some people to prevent the throwing of a Palestinian family onto the street in a week or two by an organization called the JNF, the Jewish National Fund. And it's a very racist organization. It operates in Scotland and it operates in the Balkans as a charity, but it's a pillar of Israeli apartheid and ethnic cleansing. And in Israel, it has been key to the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians over many decades, and it is still a force in the ongoing ethnic cleansing. So there you are, Olsi. This is an organization operating where I'm speaking from, operating where you are, but a key to the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians in Israel, Palestine. That suggests that there are some things that we can do to come to their aid. So it's not an antiquarian issue. It's not a historical issue done and dusted. It's something which is ongoing, and therefore we need to understand that, because there are some things that we can do.
What can we as Europeans do to stop this ethnic cleansing of Palestinians that the Israeli regime is doing since 1948?
Well, one of the bright spots in a very grim international picture at the moment, where Donald Trump is giving Israel a green light to do whatever it wishes. Obama gave them a green light, but occasionally he yanked on their chain and told them not to embarrass him. But Trump's beyond embarrassment. So Trump is allowing Netanyahu to do whatever he wants. So it's a very dangerous period. But one of the bright spots here is that across North America and across Europe, the movement to boycott and isolate the state of Israel is gaining some strength. And in fact, I would argue that the current moves to censor and to silence people like myself and yourself in Europe, the fact that there's a bill going through the US Congress which would make it a crime to do what we do here in Scotland and would impose up to a $1 million fine and possibly a 10-year jail sentence for campaigning to boycott the state of Israel. I think these methods of repression are needed because they've lost the debate. I think it's very important to acknowledge, to know that public opinion across the whole of Europe, without exception, is very, very hostile to what Israel is doing. And indeed, as far back as, forgive me if I've got this out by a year, I can supply the reference, but there was a major poll conducted by the European Union, actually, by the European Commission, spent a bit of money and interviewed people in, at that time, all 15 EU countries. And, you know, they gave them a list of countries, America, Syria, Libya, North Korea, Israel, and so on, and asked people to decide which was the greater threats to peace. In every country in Europe, without exception, majority chose Israel as the greatest threat to world peace. And the EU spokesperson for Foreign Affairs at that time, the Italian Franco Frattini, apologized to Israel for the views of Europeans. And he promised Israel that these views would not inform EU foreign policy. So the situation we face, Olsi, is one where there's militant solidarity between my government and the Israeli government, but still one of the recent Israeli ambassadors, when he left he was promoted to the UN, a guy called, a character called Ron Prosor. When Prosor left Britain, he lamented the state of public opinion in the UK. And he said, look, he compared Britain to a high-rise building. And he said, look, in the penthouse, relations are excellent. We have very good relations with government and corporate Britain. But every other level of the building, he said, is saturated with anti-Israel hostility. And he said, if that hostility continues and deepens, it will cause problems for state-to-state relations. And he was really talking about the BDS movement, the Palestinian-led international movement to boycott and isolate the state of Israel. And, you know, there's lots of things we can, as I say, I think the attempts now to silence and criminalize what we do is a response to our effectiveness. You know, I don't often think I'm very valuable, but I think there's a $1 million label on my forehead put there by the US Congress. And I never realized I was worth $1 million, but they're telling us that they're worried about the BDS campaign and what it can achieve. So, for example, dock workers in South Africa, in Durban, they don't unload Israeli goods. And a couple of years ago, there were solidarity strikes among dockers in Switzerland, some Scandinavian countries, I can't remember. I think it was Switzerland and, Sweden and Norway. And there were also solidarity strikes in ports in India and elsewhere around the world, refusing, and in California. And also, by the way, the same week that the Canadian government, I've got a Canadian passport as well, Olsi, the same week that the Canadian government criminalized boycott campaigning, dockers in Vancouver port turned away an Israeli ship. So we see ships being turned away in Tunisia recently, and in this case in European and North American ports. And that, if you think about it, that's what terrifies the Israelis. You know, they can shoot Palestinians whenever they want, but they can't shoot dockers in Scandinavia or California and make them unload Israeli goods. So we need to build a solidarity campaign to such a level that Israel is very, very isolated and not treated like a normal state. We did this with South Africa. We can do it again. Yeah.
Mick, while the Israeli regime is trying to use our governments to, in a way, criminalize our efforts on behalf of Palestinians, what they do time after time is that they resort to terrorism. In November 2016, here in Albania, in the city of Shkodra, the Israeli football team was supposed to play a football match with Albania. Now, Shkodra is a city which has a large Muslim population, and they are very pro-Palestinian. The fans, Albanian fans, they were going to go in the stadium and they were going to wave Palestinian flags. The Israeli government, which was horrified by such an action, what they did is, by using Mossad and their media, they claim that ISIS was planning to do a terrorist attack against their team. And what happened? They pushed the government of Albania and Kosovo to arrest around 20 Muslim believers in Albania and Kosovo. And these people, they were arrested only with newspaper articles from Israel, which claimed that these people were working for ISIS and they were planning to kill Israeli players. 3 days ago, after keeping these people in jail for more than 1 year and keeping them in house arrest for another 2 years, finally our courts ruled that these people were innocent. But what happened was that Israel, by spreading fake information and using the security services of Albania and Kosovo, they pushed our governments to detain, to jail, and to destroy lives of around 20 people. Many of these people, they were even beaten by Albanian anti-terror police. And because Israel has a very big influence in our countries, especially, as you know, Albania and Kosovo, we are in a way NATO US colonies. And the American ambassadors here, they are the supreme leaders. And their deputy supreme leaders are the Israeli ambassador when it comes to Albania, because they don't have an embassy in Kosovo. But what is happening here in the Balkans is that we are seeing that Israel is attacking especially the Muslim community here, which has been in the previous wars victims of ethnic cleansings and aggressions. And now they're using our governments, our security services to blackmail even football fans. And when Israel came here in 2016, the chief of Albanian Football Federation, Armando Duka, and our government of Edi Rama, our prime minister, he's a friend of Netanyahu and Tony Blair, and he's an extremist Zionist. They even warned our football fans and told them whoever waves a Palestinian flag is going to go to jail, maybe up to 5 years. So look what they're doing. I mean, apart from what they're doing in Palestine, apart from what they're doing for you guys in Western Europe and in the United States, where they're trying to criminalize even the right of us as citizens not to buy products that they produce in occupied territories, they are intimidating and blackmailing us as Europeans to not even speak about Palestine when they are here. So while in Western Europe and in the United Kingdom, I don't think that Israel will ever dare to do what they did in Albania, to arrest people with fake charges and to push your security services without facts to detain people only because they want to go to a stadium and become fans of Palestine. Here, because we have a broken legal system here, we have a law of the jungle here. I mean, the supreme leader who decides for everything here is the US ambassadors. What they're doing here is that they're turning us, the Balkans, into a jungle. And the thing that surprises us a lot is because we in Albania, during the Second World War, we saved 100% of the Jews from...
I know. Albania is unique in Europe. The only area under Axis control where Jews were safe and to which they fled,
We saved the Jews from Holocaust, and moreover, during the Ottoman times, when you had the Reconquista of Ferdinand and Isabella in Spain, where they were being killed and forcefully converted into Catholics, it was still the Ottomans, and many of these Ottoman warriors, they were Albanians, by the way, who rescued Jews from Spain and brought them to Albania and sent them even to Salonika. And now what is happening nowadays is that this Israeli regime of Benjamin Netanyahu is going even against the people who saved them from Hitler. In December 2018, I went to Palestine and I entered from Ben Gurion airport. And I was very surprised to see that the Israeli apparatchiks, those people who police Ben Gurion airport, as soon as they were seeing that you are from Albania, they would immediately ask you, what is your religion? And once they understood that you are a Muslim, they will detain you. And this is so shameful, and it goes even against the myth of Yad Vashem that the Israeli regime has contracted. And because they claim, oh, there are some good Muslims in the world who loved us and who saved us, and these are the Albanians. But what they're doing with the Albanians is really scary, and they're very, I mean, they're not thankful for what we did for them during the Second World War.
Of course not. I mean, you raise many valid points there, Olsi. And it's even worse than that. I mean, let's first of all talk about some good things. It's wonderful that Albanians tried to protest at the football game. The Israelis were very, very, what can I say? They were shocked when Argentina cancelled their game in Israel. And, you know, they were very, very disappointed by this. It was an example of the world beginning to shun Israel. And this decision by the Argentine team, I hope you don't mind me saying it, Scotland's not a very great football team, and Albania is not near the Argentina or Brazil league either. So what we can do in Scotland or Albania is fairly limited. But when the Argentine team cancelled their game in Israel, it was devastating for Israelis. We can see the power of these kinds of boycotts. But everybody who can do it makes a contribution. But if you look at, there's so many examples. Let's look at Hungary. If you look at the regime in Hungary of Orban, he is rehabilitating the World War II Nazi collaborator, Admiral Horthy. The statues now, they're calling him a great patriot. And he's the guy who sent Jews to the gas chambers, or allowed them to go to the gas chambers. Netanyahu went to Budapest. And, you know, the Jewish community in Budapest said, hey, be careful with this guy, Horthy. He's an anti-Semite. Netanyahu said, no, I don't care. He's pro-Israel. And you see time after time after time. And it's been like this also since Balfour. Balfour hated Jews. He wanted Jews to colonize Palestine, one, to control the Suez Canal for Britain, but secondly, come to Britain. It was good to get Jews out of Britain. He wanted Jews to go away. And you find that most of the Zionists in Europe were anti-Semites. And the Albanian example is a good example contrary to that. It doesn't matter how you help Jews when they're suffering. The guy whom the Haganah assassinated in Palestine, after 48, he was a Swedish diplomat. I forget his name. You can easily find it. But the UN person designated to negotiate peace in Palestine, the Zionists killed him, but he had rescued hundreds and hundreds of Jews from the Nazis 3 or 4 years earlier. It didn't matter. They hated him because he was going to inhibit their colonization and expulsion of the Palestinians. So yeah, what can we say? I think there's always an alliance between Israel and these regimes, but they cannot win the support of most of the population. And that's true in Germany. I have friends who are on trial, Palestinians and Israelis, because they protested an Israeli ambassador who defended mass killing. I have been on trial in Scotland for 5 years for boycott activity. And you know what my crime was? I was a racist. A racist because I said the word, end the siege of Gaza. It was crazy. It was thrown out. But it took 5 years of courtroom. And of course, I'm not in jail. It's not as bad as Kosovo. But still, it's an attempt to intimidate and make people afraid of standing up for Palestine. But, you know, it's not going to win. It's not going to win.
If I can interrupt you, something that I do not understand is that the Israeli regime, while it claims that it represents the Jews of all the world, but we know many Jews simply reject, especially the regime of Netanyahu. They say we have nothing in common with him. What is very interesting, as you mentioned, by showing what Orban is doing with Netanyahu, we have the same in Albania. I mean, yes. Here in Albania, under the government of Edi Rama, our Prime Minister, who claims to be a reborn Catholic like Tony Blair, and he's a very good friend of Tony Blair, but both of them, they claim to be Catholics, but they don't follow the Catholic Church. They're Zionist Catholics. But what is happening even in Albania, we have our Prime Minister who is rehabilitating Nazi collaborators, people like Jazexhi Fishta, who is a national hero here in Albania, and we teach him to our school children. People like him, or Maria Tutsi, or Dom Doro Tsaka, or Dom John Gazuli, etc. We have so many people who have been so violent anti-Semites. And by the way, Jazexhi Fishta, who is one of the major heroes of the establishment of our authoritarian prime minister here in Albania, because for the information of our viewers who see this video here, we do not have a parliament in Albania. Our prime minister, he stole the elections. He has stolen 2 elections here, and the opposition has left the parliament. It is a total mess, and we live in a dictatorship here in Albania. But the only thing why we don't hear in the Western media's voices to speak against our Prime Minister Edi Rama is because he's a puppet of George Soros and a good friend of Tony Blair. Tony Blair comes here throughout the summer, spends his holidays, Sarkozy and what have you. But the question.
Did you say Tony Blair comes to Albania?
Yes.
You know, Tony Blair cannot appear in public anywhere in Britain. If he appears in public, there'll be big protests. He doesn't dare to appear in public. So I'm sorry you get him, but that's because he can't appear in public here.
Even here, he doesn't appear in public. He comes with his private jet. They have their own private beaches here with our prime minister, and the other war criminal, Nicolas Sarkozy of France, they also come. So, I mean, one of the reasons why in the West we don't hear so much bad publicity about our authoritarian prime minister here is because he's a friend of these big pro-Zionist elites. But my question again is that while our prime minister is a darling of George Soros and a good friend of Netanyahu, what he's doing here is he's rehabilitating extremist, fascist, and Nazi collaborators, people like I mentioned, Jazexhi Fishta, who, when Hitler did the Kristallnacht, he wrote a very lengthy article in a local magazine of the Catholic Church here, and he was defending Hitler in that time. So what I find very interesting in our discussion about Palestinians, but about Israel and Jews as well, is that the regime of Netanyahu, while it claims that it is representing the Jewish people, that it is defending them from Holocaust, it goes and sits with fascists, people from Orban to Edi Rama. So this regime, which persecutes the Palestinians, which is trying to remove and ethnically cleanse all Palestine from the native people of Palestine, on the other hand, claims to be the protectors of the Jews throughout the world. On the other hand, goes and eats and dines and sits and has friends, people who are Nazi sympathizers.
Let me come back to, just because we mentioned it earlier, I could give 100 examples, but let's go back to Argentina. In Argentina, that was ruled by a military dictatorship at the end of the 20th century, in 1970s and 80s and 70s. A very brutal dictatorship which killed many thousands of young Argentines. They often flew them in helicopters over the South Atlantic and dropped them in the middle of the ocean. It was very brutal, mass killing. They were tortured in military establishments and then killed, disappeared. To this day, there are the mothers of the disappeared ones who still campaign to be told what happened to their sons and daughters. It just so happens that, like Britain in the 1930s, many of the people who were killed were leftists, trade unionists and so on. And it just so happened that in Argentina at that time, many young Jews were leftists as well. and a disproportionate number of Jews were captured and killed by the junta. And you know, the leader of the Jewish community in Buenos Aires, what was his name? I forget his name, but he wrote to the Israeli embassy and said, "Oh, please help us. This junta will release people if they have a visa to go to another country." So, for example, I was involved many years ago in helping Chilean people to come to Britain, because if you could get them a job offer, the dictatorship would release them and put them on a plane. The Israeli embassy came back to the Jewish community spokesman in Buenos and said, "Look, we have good relations with this government. They report to Washington. We report to Washington. We have just increased arms sales." And later it comes out that not only were these people being tortured and killed in military prisons with a picture of Adolf Hitler on the wall, the Israelis were training the torturers who were killing young Jews. So Zionism is quite happy to work with anti-Semitic regimes. After all, Olsi, they agree. The anti-Semites want to kick out the Jews, and the Israelis say, "Okay, we'll take them if they're the right kind of Jew." And I could give you many examples of this, but Argentina is one. But so many times you find regimes. Look, in the beginning of June, we commemorate a man called Jacob de Haan. Jacob de Haan was a Dutch Jew. He lived in Palestine at the time of the Balfour Declaration, and he was appointed the spokesperson for the Palestinian Jews to oppose the Balfour Declaration. He was assassinated by the Haganah, the Zionist militia, as he was leaving a synagogue in, I think 1920, 21. Jacob de Haan. And we remember him every year because it tells us what the Zionists don't hesitate to kill Jews. Let me give you another example. A man who sadly died a few years ago, but I have some friends who are Iraqis. When you know, the Jewish community in Iraq is as old as in Palestine. They go back to thousands of years. And in 1948, when the Jewish state was declared in Palestine, the Iraqi Jews didn't want to leave. They had a good life in Iraq. And now we know from the memoirs of a guy called Gilad, it'll come back to me. Naim Giladi, sorry. Naim Giladi. Naim Giladi was a Zionist militant who joined the underground in Iraq under the British regime. He described what they did. When the Jews would not leave Iraq to go to Israel, they set off bombs in Jewish cafes in Baghdad to drive that, and then they would give out leaflets saying, "Quick, escape, get out of Iraq, it's dangerous." And this is the dirty tricks of the Zionists from the very beginning, to persuade Jews to go to Palestine who didn't want to go to Palestine. And, you know, so many examples also we could talk about. But today, what I think is good news is that Israel is becoming identified with Orban, with Bolsonaro, with Trump, and they're very dirty and very dangerous, but they will fall. They will fall. And I think Israel will be weakened, so that even in America, some politicians are now beginning publicly to speak out against aid to Israel. You know the names, yeah?
Yeah, I do not know if you have ever been to Israel, Palestine.
Many times. 19 times. I'm banned now. My passport says no.
Yeah.
Last time I was put in prison.
But what I noticed in December 2018 when I visited Palestine was that the Israeli regime is using fear and intimidation and censorship even against its own citizens. When I was in Tel Aviv, and I was traveling with the train from Tel Aviv to Ben Gurion Airport, I had a discussion with an Israeli lady. And by the way, she asked me where I was from and what I thought of Israel. And I told her I'm horrified. I mean, this is a horrible country. And she told me why. And I told her, but have you seen what you do to the Palestinians? She said, no, we don't know too much. I told her, have you ever gone to Jabalia? There is a crossing point, not Jabalia, there is another name, I forgot.
Kalandia.
To Kalandia crossing point. And she said, no, we are not allowed. So, and I started explaining to her what the Israeli army was doing to Palestinians in the West Bank, because I visited the West Bank as well. And, she told me, they don't let us. We have censorship in here. So this Israeli regime, it is evil not only with the Palestinians, but even with its own citizens. For example, you as an Israeli, you are not allowed to go into the Palestinian territories. They don't want the Palestinians and Jews to coexist and live with each other. In many villages and towns that I visited, for example, I went to Jericho, Nablus, Hebron. So everywhere, especially in Jericho, in every village and town that you go, you'll see a big sign put by the Israeli regime warning the Jews not to enter into Arab towns and Arab villages.
Sure.
So they practice a very fascist and old-fashioned segregation policies, where they keep Arabs and Israelis apart from each other.
Sorry.
It's okay.
Very sorry, Olsi, apologies.
So they keep Israelis and Palestinians apart from each other, and they try to radicalize even their own population. But the thing, what I have observed during my visit in Israel and Palestine is that this is a military utopian fascist regime, which in my opinion does not have a long life. The only thing that keeps this regime running, because this is a military state. I mean, in Israel, everybody was a soldier.
Well, some people say every state has an army, but the Israeli army has its own state. And I think this tells you how the state is controlled in many, many levels by the army. It's very unusual for a prime minister not to be a military war criminal. The great bulk of them have been,
It is a fascist state. It is a fascist, if I could put it, Anglo-American sponsored colony in the Middle East. Because in my opinion, without the money that the West gives to Israel, I think this state will not last even a day. Because they spend so much on the military. They spend so much on the soldiers. Everyone was a soldier there. I was wondering, I was saying, who works for these people? People who work there are the Palestinians and the immigrants who come from Thailand and Asia and what have you. So this is a utopian state gone crazy, a state that is being run by an extreme chauvinist nationalistic ideology, an ideology that we saw in the Balkans or we saw in Europe during the Second World War. They are very old-fashioned, but which for some reason the West or Americans and the British in a way are supporting them for their geopolitical interests. Now I have a final question for you, if you don't mind.
Sure.
Netanyahu is claiming that with the support of Pompeo and the extreme evangelicals who nowadays run the Trump administration, he's claiming that the Israeli regime is going to annex the West Bank. What do you think is the world going to do about it? And what do you think will be the outcome of this annexation?
Well, it's very difficult to see at the moment, but I think there's a couple of things we can see. One, the elites in Europe are very alarmed by Netanyahu and Gantz's move that they're now preparing to annex the West Bank. I think we need to defend any degree of Palestinian control over any village. So we should oppose this. But I think the Zionist plan has always been to control the whole of Palestine without exception. And I think we need to have an idea of how we can move forward. I think Israel uses fascist levels of violence, But I disagree, Olsi. I don't think it's useful to consider it to be a fascist state. Every dictatorship is not fascist. I think it's better to think about it like America in the 18th century or the British in Australia, murdering and killing large numbers of native people. And I think it's a species of settler colonialism, where Europeans go somewhere and they often exterminate the natives because they don't go to exploit the natives, they go to replace them, and they bring in families. So I think you can look at the genocidal potential of Israel, its ability to use, its readiness to use massive violence. The killings in the Gaza periphery already are just absolutely disgraceful. But I think it's because it's just a dirty little example of the same settler colonialism that flooded from Europe across the world in the, since the 17th century, actually. And I think but moving forward to answer your question, I think my government is worried that when we have we already have a single state between the Mediterranean and the Jordan River, between Lebanon and Egypt. It's a single state. It's an apartheid state. It's racist. The Palestinians are treated as very inferior, barely human beings, but it's one state. And I don't think there's a future for two states in Palestine. I think it was a mistake to recognize Israel in the various, Oslo Accords, because they didn't want 78%, they wanted 100%, and they've now got 92% or 90, even more, controlled by the Israeli army. So I think we should say I think the Israelis should beware of getting their wish, because when they control that whole area, the struggle then becomes one for human rights, to defeat Zionism, to remove the kind of apartheid that exists right across the whole of Palestine, 48, 67, and so on. So, but anyway, that's an ongoing conversation. How do we begin to defeat Zionism? And personally, I don't think the solution will be like Algeria, where the settlers came and they were finally kicked out, although 1 million people died. I don't think it's like that. I think it'll be something like South Africa, where the settlers stay, but the supremacy has to go. And I think the Palestinians may decide to accept the settlers, but the Jewish supremacy has to be defeated, has to be ended. Does that make sense?
The problem with these Zionist supremacists is that they want the Palestine without Palestinians.
Of course.
Another
but it's
question.
Impossible.
I mean,
impossible. Also, they're surrounded by 400 million Arabs.
Yeah, but look, Israel was successful after all in its destruction of Syria and the creation of these terrorist organizations like ISIS and Nusra. Through the Syrian civil war, they managed to remove from Syria almost half of its population. And those Syrians who were neighbors to Israel, today they are sitting in London, in Berlin, in Albania, in Rome, and what have you. So in a way, the Syrian civil war that the West and Israel supported, by the way, in my opinion, it was a successful story on removing the native Arabs from their land and throwing them to you guys in UK. So in all these Syrian refugees that you have, they came because of the American and Israeli policies towards Syria. So the big question mark that we have is that this supremacist is that after annexing the West Bank, they will not like to have these people that are there, and they are not few, there are millions of Palestinians. So solution number one that they're going to do is what they already have done. They're going to turn these cities like Nablus, Jericho, what have you, into open prisons. I mean, into prison cities or concentration camps. But the question is for how long they will be keeping these people there, and what will be the trick that they're going to use to expel these people towards Europe. Because I believe that their final plan is to expel the Palestinians from Palestine.
There's no sign that they think they could do this now. And I think that I can't see the future clearly, but I know that if there had been 400 million Native Americans, the whites wouldn't have won. If there had been 100 million Apaches, I think Geronimo would have won. But they were so few compared to the incoming settlers, and they were defeated. Although they haven't completely surrendered, they still struggle. But I think Israel has been successful so far. The Zionists have been very successful so far. But as you said earlier, that state is not sustainable. There are equal numbers of Zionist Jews, probably fewer, and Palestinians between the Mediterranean and the Jordan River. Will they expel them into Jordan? Not so easy. And if they don't, then I think worldwide, the struggle in Palestine becomes not between two peoples over land, but becomes a struggle for justice against apartheid. And that, I think, spells the end of the Zionist project. And it's not just my opinion. Many Zionists are afraid of Netanyahu. And they say that what he's doing is killing the Zionist dream. And, you know, I think there's some truth in that, Olsi. But can I thank you again for the invitation to share these thoughts, whatever they are, with your viewers. And perhaps we can return to this at some time in the future, Olsi.
All right. Thank you very much for coming on my show. And let's keep open our communication and observe the great tragedy of the Palestinian people and what this utopian state and regime is doing with them. Thank you very much, Mike.
Thanks again, Olsi. A great pleasure. Bye-bye.
Bye.